You are listening to CEO Perspectives, a podcast by the Conference Board.
Welcome to this episode of CEO Perspectives, a new podcast series by the Conference Board. CEO Perspectives are conversations that take an objective, data-driven look at a range of timely topics that matter most to business executives. To help make sense of these topics, how they'll unfold, we'll sit down with thought leaders and do what we do best at the Conference Board, provide trusted insights for what's ahead. I'm Steve Odland, the CEO of the Conference Board and the host of this podcast series. And today's conversation will be part two of my discussion with Ed Cox on the history of U.S.-China relations, just as Deng Xiaoping came into power and began a series of reforms that earned him the reputation of the architect of modern China. Ed Cox is with me, corporate lawyer, finance lawyer from Patterson, Belknap, Webb, and Tyler, former chairman of the New York Republican Party, trustee of the Conference Board's Committee for Economic Development, but probably most importantly to all this, he was Richard Nixon's son-in-law, married Tricia Nixon, and was a firsthand participant. Ed, thanks for joining me for part two of this conversation.
It's a pleasure, Steve.
So, Ed, in 1979, as Deng came to power, you went to China with President Nixon. So these stories in what you're going to talk about were firsthand experiences. What happened? So I'll start with the background of the trip and then talk about what happened during the trip.
Well, the background is that in 1976, former President Nixon, the People's Republic of China, Mao, sent a plane to bring him to Beijing. Mao was dying at the time. He could barely communicate. He had to talk through his female aides who were with him. But in that conversation, they discussed what would happen beyond peace, because they had established peace at that. There's peace in Vietnam, certainly. There was the conversations going on between the United States and the People's Republic of China. And Mao's response to it, beyond peace, there's justice, which is very interesting, and it was the title of President Nixon's last book, incidentally, that he wrote, What is Beyond Peace? Justice. It's interesting that Mao would bring that up. But in 70, after Mao passed, there was then a struggle for power. And he had appointed as his successor, as chairman, Mr. Guo. And Zhou, who died also in 1976, his chief of staff was Deng Xiaoping. And when I visited there in 1979 with former President Nixon, the two were vying for power. We met with both Guo and we met with Deng Xiaoping. The Cultural Revolution had come to an end, and the question was, where would China go next?
Right, and this was interesting because the two of you went. And you were essentially summoned, as you said, but this was during the Carter administration. Talk about how did that come to be, and how did the Carter administration view all this?
Well, the Carter administration very much wanted to carry to the next step, and they had just recently, just before the trip, recognized the People's Republic of China officially, and that was quite a shock to Taiwan, of course. Richard Nixon had finished his memoirs, which he did in California. He had come back to New York, where Tricia and I lived, and he saw that Deng Xiaoping had, in 1978, issued the 4 modernizations, particularly in agriculture, and loosening up all the restraints on the socialist restraints on agriculture so that China could feed its people. And Richard Nixon said, this is interesting, and wanted to do that trip and started communicating with China. Of course, they welcomed him to come. And that was a trip precisely at the time that Deng was opening up to investment from abroad with his joint venture agreement. And it was a very timely trip with a very interesting man who changed China and made modern China. And that was Mr. Deng Xiaoping, a fascinating figure.
So talk about that that trip? Because you had a lot of interesting experiences in that time.
Well, yeah, we first went to Hong Kong. Before you go to China at that time, you always went to Hong Kong, picked up what was going on from people there. The Chinese sent a special train to take us to what was then called Canton. And it was a very interesting train ride because I stood on the back of the train in the open air and watched the China landscape go by. And China must have been still doing agriculture in the fields as they had been doing it for millennium. Things hadn't really changed in China. In Canton, we met with the mayor, and he didn't know what the heck was going on. Here to have Richard Nixon there, he was so scared he couldn't say a thing. He couldn't say a thing. It was complete silence during the meal, except for a very brief toast, and that was it. And then they sent a plane to fly us to Beijing, and there we first met with Hua Guofeng, who was the chairman of Mao's appointed chairman of the party, and then with Deng Xiaoping, who I think was then the vice premier, but his title did not matter. Deng Xiaoping was clearly in the ascendant, and Hua Guofeng was about to go on a diplomatic, quote-unquote, trip around Europe. But Deng was really running the show. The way they did things then, they didn't even arrest him. He just sort of bounced down the chain of lower offices and ended up in retirement.
It's interesting that you described, Hong Kong was the gateway. It was I'm sure most people remember, but some may not, that it was controlled by the British in this period of time, and it was a very first world city. And so, that's where all the traffic for Westerners started in China. This private train, I'm smiling because, that was 1979. I mean, there were very few roads people don't realize this. You go to the border of Hong Kong and then enter into what's called the new territories, go up the Pearl River Delta. But it's like at that point in time, it's like going back hundreds of years in terms of development, wasn't it?
That's just exactly what I felt. It was like reading a Pearl book about the great earth, the good earth, and agriculture in China. In fact, still, there is a huge split between the cities, where all the action, the middle class is growing, and the countryside, which in many ways hasn't changed. And if you are registered in the countryside, you stay in the countryside unless you're going to the city to do some work, some labor, and then you go back to the countryside. So there's a division between the more prosperous cities and the countryside, which President Xi presently has to deal with. And those are two different Chinas.
Yeah, and then that was very apparent in that time. But let's talk about Deng Xiaoping, because as you say, he was a transformative figure. Mao was a transformative figure in one way, led the Cultural Revolution, But Deng is the one who really began this process of modernizing China. Talk about him and the significance of his rise to power.
Well, it was, I'm a note taker, and they start their conversation talking about how each one's going to live 100 years and this and that, sort of normal back and forth with an interpreter. And here's Deng dressed in a gray Mao suit with white socks, his feet not touching the ground. He's a very small stature, bouncing up and down in his chair because he was excited, talking with President Nixon and describing what he was going to do with respect to more open markets and price-driven things, and welcoming investment into China from abroad. And of course, there was interest in how things had developed in Taiwan, because Taiwan was thriving at the time, as was Singapore and other areas where there was a Chinese population. And the Chinese population abroad had done very well. And he wanted, in many ways, to imitate that and to modernize China the way Chinese people around the world, or particularly around Asia, were modernizing where they lived.
Yeah, and you were a firsthand participant in these conversations. Tell us about, a few of the highlights of these conversations.
Yeah, I just one thing I didn't add. He was a chain smoker, interestingly, and he would switch from menthol to regular cigarettes. And he lived to 94, so I don't know what that says about smoking. And everyone smoked in China at the time, and I believe they still do to a large extent. But it was a serious conversation. with him talking about how he wanted to reform China with more price-driven markets. As a question in my mind as I was listening to it. And then at one point he asked President Nixon, he said, "What's the World Bank rate?" Out of the blue. And President Nixon did not have an answer for that. Fortunately, I was doing some deals with the World Bank, and I did know the rate, 7.75%, something like. Remember, this was '79. It was an inflationary period of high interest rates. That was a pretty good rate. But here he was interested in interest rates that he could get loans from the World Bank to develop China. He was very serious about China's opening to the world and making it work. And even though he never really had a strong official, he wasn't the premier, he wasn't the chairman. In the end, he was running China, and China was focused on him. And China, coming out of the Cultural Revolution, they just wanted economic development and prosperity. And he had his axioms that he said, it doesn't matter whether the cat is black or white, it matters how it catches mice. Another one, it's glorious to be rich. In communist China, for him to say that. And believe me, the Chinese took him at his word, and their entrepreneurial spirit took over. And when there's some question, even though at the time, near the end of his reign, he had no position except being chairman of the All China Bridge League. I mean, bridge, like the card game. He liked to play it. And that was his only position, but he took a trip down to southern China, to Guangzhou, and visited the economic development in the special economic development zone that was going on there. And China understood that I was saying that was good, that's the way China should go, and that kept China's development going forward through the 90s.
Yeah, in the juxtaposition of the Mao era, which was a closed era, it was, communes, the theory was communes, it was, the work camps, everybody dressed the same, literally in Mao jacket, da-da-da-da-da. Just talk about that juxtaposition from that to Deng, who's talking about, world interest rates, about trading with the world, about opening up joint ventures. I mean, this is, night and day. You must have felt like you were transported to the moon.
Well, the Chinese people just took to it as if it was natural almost. The old capitalists who had still stayed in China, and they gave up a lot, obviously, but they stayed there. They were given special portfolios to develop, and they did what they did before 1949, and that kind of led the way. In the agricultural side, in these collectives, people were given large plots where they could, in fact, develop their own grains and fruits, whatever, and sell them on an open market. And boy, they took to it. And China became, where before it had to import food, it became self-sufficient in agriculture. And while they were importing technology, of course, the most important thing for them was entry into the WTO, the World Trade Organization, and that really opened up the whole world to them. But that came later in the early part of the first decade of the 21st century.
So far, we've talked about what's happening in China in the late 70s and into the early 80s and Deng's political rule. Next, we're going to look at Tiananmen Square as well as China's role throughout Asia. We'll take a short break and we'll be right back.
Interested in this content? You can find this and much more at our Conference Board website, www.conference-board.org. Or, even better, contact our membership team and your company can enjoy the benefits of our in-depth research around the economy, environmental, social, and governance issues, public policy, marketing and communications, and human capital. As a member of the Conference Board, you will be able to have full access to all of our cutting-edge research, leading indicators, benchmarking, and data services, in addition to webcasts and podcasts such as the one you are enjoying now.
Welcome back to CEO Perspectives. I'm your host, Steve Odland, the CEO of the Conference Board, and I'm joined by Ed Cox, who is President Nixon's son-in-law, law partner, businessman, and also a trustee of the CED. Ed, welcome back. Let's talk about the Tiananmen Square protest, because there's so much that has been made about that publicly. It was sort of a transition point. It was the start of media access by the media of events, internal domestic events, and so forth. So this was a really unique thing that happened in China.
Yeah, while we all see Deng Xiaoping as being a very benevolent figure who brought China back into the modern era and really he let the economy develop without putting socialist clamps on it. The fact is, even in our conversation in 1979, he said, we just fought a war with Vietnam and we taught them a lesson. And it was all about Cambodia and Vietnam going into Cambodia, which was an ally of the People's Republic of China. But what actually happened there was the vanguard of the Cultural Revolution was the People's Liberation Army, and they'd become very political. And he purposely sent the most politicized unit in to face the battle-hardened Vietnamese, and they were just slaughtered by the Vietnamese. And it was a lesson to the army: stay out of politics, go into the barracks, and learn how to fight. So you're talking about, in a couple of months, 60,000 deaths in the Red Army, as well as on the Vietnamese side. And the Vietnamese knew eventually the Red Army could overwhelm them, and there was a truce made, and Deng Xiaoping called it a victory in our meeting. But that was the real background. The point I'm making is he knew how to be brutal, too. And when the Communist Party was challenged at Tiananmen with students and making the Statue of Liberty and these praise of democracy and Western values, at a certain point, and there was a good portion of the Communist Party that encouraged that, including the premier at the time, Deng Xiaoping fired the premier and sent in the troops and slaughtered the students. And the point that was made there, Western values are not the way we're going. We're going to stay as the Communist Party is going to continue to run the show, even though we liberalize our economy and grow into being a world power. The second big event that was interesting at that time was, of course, the result of détente and Reagan's policies was the fall of the Berlin Wall and the dissolution of the Soviet Union. In that process, one of their allies, it's very interesting the way this small group of old men who ran China at the time saw it. They were very close to Ceausescu in Romania. And Romania was killed in that process by his comrades in the Communist Party. They wanted to get rid of him. And Romania became a democracy, of course. And that was a real shock at the same time, the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the death of their ally. They did not want that to happen to them and for that to happen to the Communist Party. That sort of, with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, if you think about it, one, rejection of democracy and Western values. The main protagonist of that is the United States. The end of the Soviet Union now becomes very weak Russia. Who is their main antagonist? The United States. And thereafter, Deng's basic theme was build and hide our strength while we develop. And that's what they did for a long period of time. And here in the United States, we saw them as, they're going to keep developing into a middle-class democracy, and Taiwan and China will naturally grow together, and we will have great relations with them. In fact, the Communist Party still was determined to run the show.
Yeah, and it's fascinating how interrelated all of these happenings around the world are, because, when you read history, you read it in pieces, or you read it, in chapters, and it's contained to what's happening in that country, that there, or it's bilateral. But the dynamism of this whole shift, in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, definitely changed the dynamics between China and the Western world, and it scared them, I think.
It did. But we were not aware, really, of that the Communist Party was never going to give up power. But economic development was very important to them, and to that extent, they gave up economic power to let China develop so it could have a strong economy and be a strong China again and reestablish its natural place in the world. It's very interesting. This is nothing that's new. You go back to Napoleon. Why do I bring him up? He made a comment about China. He said, "There lies China, a sleeping giant. Let it sleep, because when it awakens, it will move the world." After their several centuries of weakness, in this period of time, China developed its economic power, its military power, and Deng Xiaoping wisely designated his two successors. And they each had a 10-year period, and then after that 10-year period, as president and as running the military commission and also being chairman of the party. The first, Jiang Zemin, then had to turn over to the second, Hu Jintao, and that took them to 2012. And basically, those two presidents followed Deng's policy, build our strength, and hide it. That was until we get to the present President Xi, who felt at that point it was time to change Deng's system. He is now looking to have, at the end of his 10-year reign, to continue to run China, in fact, to be a new Mao, to assert the power of the Communist Party over the economy more, and yet benefit from their previous economic growth to build up their military, to threaten Taiwan and the present dilemma that we have, and that he has really disclosed that they are not going to, that they really have a vision of the world, as Napoleon pointed out a long time ago, that they were really going to move the world and assert modern China.
Yeah, and it's fascinating to hear that Napoleon comment, because it was 200 years ago, and yet nothing has really changed. And I think this is what Westerners don't realize about China. It's a proud society that's thousands and thousands and thousands of years old. It was, one of the greatest societies of all time, with some series of empires, the inventions that took place, the advancement of humankind. And so, today's memories lead back to sort of this dark period in their history. That pride about, their history and their natural, what they view as their natural role in the world, I think has got to be held in the backdrop of all relations today. And I think this is sometimes what's missed, when Westerners engage in China.
Yeah, it's interesting. After Tiananmen, President Bush, again, wanted to, despite the horror in the United States political system of what happened in Tiananmen, as seen a setback for democracy in China, President Bush wanted to reach out to China. As you know, his national security advisor, Scowcroft, went there, and that was, of course, hit by the press when they heard about it. But I was sent on a mission at that time, carrying President Nixon's portfolio, but being briefed by Bush 41's National Security Council in order to get a dissident who had been a part of the communist elite. They felt he was a traitor. They wouldn't let him out of our embassy where he was taking refuge. And that was something that we had to get him out of China some way. And the object of the Bush administration was to continue to develop good relations with China, the thought that China would eventually evolve into a free market democratic society. Of course, it wasn't going to happen, but it is interesting that they took that happened. Now, I met with one of the leaders of China, one of the members of the Standing Committee of the Politburo, and he actually said, if you were representing your government, I would say this Feng Lizhe is a traitor, is a criminal, but instead, since you're representing President Nixon, I will say this. And he gave me a plan by which he could get out of the embassy and remove that impediment to better relations. Interesting, I went back to the Ambassador Lilly, and he said, please go and tell Brent Scowcroft of this. He wanted me to give President Bush this directly, because Ambassador Lilly, even though he was very close personally to President Bush, he had to report to Secretary of State Baker, who saw better relations with Communist China as a political liability and might not pass the plan onto the White House. So we had our own politics going on our side, and I became a little bit involved in that on this particular mission.
Well, before we wrap up here, I think you have to address the current situation between China and Taiwan. Talk about where you think that all is going.
Xi is a hardcore communist, and he is concerned with holding on to power. As it's clear, power can still move away from him. The two former presidents are still alive, the successors of Deng Xiaoping. Deng Xiaoping's son has, in fact, written a tract against what President Xi was doing. So there are some political crosscurrents in China as he goes for another 10-year term in the end. And that's all coming up next year. But in this process, he has reasserted on the economy, and we have seen it with respect to a number of their large tech companies, where he's basically took them apart because they were getting too strong for them, and their leaders, who are billionaires, were attracting political attention. And even with celebrities, if they got a little bit too important and were capturing the use of China as idols, he was just shutting them down. So the question is, will China's economy, with that kind of Communist Party interference in their business affairs, in effect, put the economy into rear gear? And I think that's happening. The best analysis that I have gotten, and this is from economists inside China as well as outside, is that they are growing at less than 2%, not at the 6% that they claim to be growing. And a lot of that growing is apartment buildings that are getting built willy-nilly and have no occupants in them, and eventually will have to be torn down. It's a misallocation of resources and a lack of substantive growth. And the question is where that will lead. Meanwhile, if China economy goes into a big stall, will Xi then have to make some military move, particularly against Taiwan, in order to arouse a nationalist spirit behind him, as much as Putin did with respect to the Crimea when he felt threatened by a color revolution, such as the one that happened in Kiev of the Ukraine just before he moved into and took over the Crimea. That was the first time that a major power had taken over a part of another country. And that's the question, would Xi do it? Would he do it next year? Well, he's got the Winter Olympics coming up. He's got his own Congress where he would be elected General Secretary again for another 10 years. I don't think he would do it next year, but at a certain point, that is the issue, and that is why the focus is very much on Taiwan now. Could it be defended? What would we do to defend it? Would we commit American troops? Or do they have the will to defend themselves? That's another question. But all those things are now that focus is because of the impact of communist rule really moving in on the free economy that Deng and his two successors created.
And so, ironically, we need to be thinking about 23 and 24 and the state of the Chinese economy as it relates to potential actions in Taiwan. Ed Cox, thanks so much for joining us. This has been just a fascinating discussion.
I've enjoyed it very much, Steve.
And thanks to all of you for listening in to CEO Perspectives. Every few weeks, I'll be joined by a leader from our centers and business executives to provide insights on the issues of our time. We'll cover the leading topics in public policy, environmental, social, and governance, marketing, communications, the economy, human capital, and much more. Please share CEO Perspectives with your colleagues. I know they will all want to listen. I'm Steve Odland, and this podcast has been brought to you by the Conference Board.
You have been listening to CEO Perspectives, a podcast by the Conference Board.